Chapter 45. The Last Dance. People with concussions are the last ones to figure out how badly hurt they are. I was more responsible than anyone for downplaying my condition to myself and everyone else. Somewhere inside me, a fearful voice cried out that I was seriously hurt, but that same voice warned me to quit listening to my brain because it was my brain itself that was damaged. So I let myself go on believing that the problem was a sore neck. I drifted through every day in a pale-faced, sweaty, head-pounding stupor, pacified to the point of numbness by the 4 Advils I took every 3 hours. The turn of the millennium floated right past me. By January 3, 2000, I was in Greensboro, South Carolina, for Nitro, and in too much of a haste to heed my own vow to Bush and Russo 1 week earlier, that I'd only do wrestling and in a ring. I rubbed the back of my head as Russo laid out the script to hype my upcoming pay-per-view title match on January 14th, with Psycho Sid. That night Nitro opened as cameras caught Sid attacking me as I came into the building. I was thrown into backstage walls and knocked into a stack of steel trusses that broke apart, spilling everywhere, nearly clipping my knees and ankles and coming close to crushing all my toes. Working a backstage brawl was far more dangerous than an actual wrestling match. I was soon battered to the concrete floor over thick wire cables and equipment boxes, where Sid stood pummeling me with a barrage of punches. Only a few hours earlier, road agent Terry Taylor had successfully begged me to fill in for Kevin Nash for the rest of the week because Nash was out with a concussion, of all things. With nobody else to replace Nash in the main events, I said I would, even as I reminded Terry that I thought I might have a concussion of my own. Guys such as Taylor and Russo were quick to tell me how much this all was appreciated, assuring me that I'd be protected in every way possible. Unfortunately, this was a promise that neither one of them could keep or even had a right to make, because they weren't the ones in the ring with me. Every night I crawled into bed, my head pounding and my neck aching. My solution was more Advil and another fitful sleep. In Florence, South Carolina for Thunder, I opened up the show standing glassy-eyed in my NWO t-shirt, along with NWO members Jeff Jarrett, Scotty Steiner, and Kevin Nash, who appeared not to be suffering from a concussion after all. Russo's new acting commissioner, Terry Funk, had just ordered me to face him in a hardcore match later in the show. Somewhere in the back of my mind I remembered having his retirement match with him back in Amarillo. With a scornful over-the-top sneer, I coldly cut a promo, "I think I just might have to kill you tonight, Terry Funk." I laughed to myself at how ridiculous I sounded, but I gave Russo what he wanted because I'd all but given up. I also knew that I could trust Terry with my body a hell of a lot more I could trust the other WCW wrestlers. Terry did all he could to go easy on my head, even as we brawled around the ring and on the floor with chairs, rubber bats, and garbage cans. I beat Terry hard, loud, and mercilessly with a steel chair, right down to his knees, because he made me promise to lay it in. Terry was old school, the king of hardcore for real. He spent most of the match selling for me, flopping around like a fish. When he finally charged me with a steel chair, I got my hands up and deflected it completely. So far, so good. I staggered off in retreat, making my way up the aisle as Terry grabbed a fistful of my hair and tossed me into a big, rolling canvas laundry bin that just happened to be sitting right there. With my legs hanging over the sides, I couldn't pull myself up into a better position. Terry spun it around and pushed it hard toward the ring. I braced myself by wrapping my arms around my head, but when I spilled out I whacked the back of my head on the heavy wooden lid of the cart, which made a sound like a dropped watermelon. After the match, Terry felt terrible, but it wasn't his fault. I shouldn't have been in a hardcore match with a concussion in the first place. I gulped down another handful of Advils and didn't give it another thought, but I sure wished my horrible headaches would go away. And when I finally called Marcy, back in Calgary, to set up a doctor's appointment, it was because I thought I needed my sore neck looked at, not my head. I filled in for Nash against Sid in Roanoke, Lowell, and Utica. Each night I took a choke slam and a powerbomb. Sid did everything he could to set me down as lightly as he could, but it was nearly impossible. I took my lumps with little complaint. In Utica, New York, I was needed to make a call to a radio station using the phone in an office across from the dressing room. I stripped down to my black singlet and left Doug Dillinger sitting outside my dressing room like a fat old sheriff to guard my stuff. Over the past year, Dillinger and his crack security team had allowed every one of my leather ring jackets to be stolen by fans until I stopped wearing them. After the call to the radio station, I returned to my dressing room to find Doug snoozing and all my wrestling gear stolen, except for one pink and white boot. Amazingly, the thieves never thought to grab my wallet, which was in the pocket of my jeans still hanging there, or my Rolex, which was tucked into my shoe. On January 9th I worked in State College, Pennsylvania, wearing my workout gear. That night I got a phone message from Martha letting me know that a judge had been picked and the trial date was set for February 5, 2001. Could at least see light at the end of the tunnel now. I also got a message from Stu telling me that he and my mom agreed completely with everything I'd written in my column in that week's Calgary Sun. I'd written an impassioned piece about the state of the business and how, when a fan asked me if wrestling is real, I realized that I didn't even know the answer to that question anymore. It once bothered me when people thought wrestling was fake, and now it bothered me that they thought we were really hurting ourselves and one another. The sad part was that we were. In the column, I wrote that the colossal pulverizing that Goldberg gave me had been real, and so were Jerry Flynn's stiff kicks. When the Hitman tried to kill Psycho Sid with a monster truck, it was fake. But when I careened out of control and nearly crashed my rental car into the television truck, that was real. I'd written about how my match in Kansas City with Chris Benoit was the ghost of what wrestling used to be, but what I had always thought it was meant to be. And I asked myself in the column, how far I could bend without breaking in order to help WCW beat Vince McMahon. Maybe I'd gone too far already. Maybe the whole wrestling business was fucked up now, including me. I didn't know when I got up on January 10, 2000, that this would be the day I'd have the very last match of my 23-year career. My head ached miserably and it was a long drive from State College to Syracuse, where I caught an early morning flight to Buffalo. I dropped my bags on the floor at the Avis car rental counter and made small talk with a lady working there. I happened to glance over my shoulder and caught Nasty Girl poking her head out from behind a cement pillar across the street. I was tired, fed up and sick of the threat of her doing God knows what to me. I matter-of-factly asked the Avis lady, "Have you ever seen a real-life stalker before?" She couldn't help but notice this large girl poking her head out from behind the pillar over my shoulder, and she began taking me more seriously. "You're not kidding, are you?" "No, I'm not." She asked me if I'd mind if she called the airport police, and I told her that not only would I not mind, I would greatly appreciate it. Within a few minutes, 3 policemen showed up and we had a brief chat. 2 of the officers walked me to my car, while one headed over to ask Nasty Girl a few questions. I drove off to my hotel. I called Julie when I got to the hotel, and we'd opened up our next round of peace talks when we were interrupted by a knock at my door. I set the phone down and found one of the policemen I'd just said goodbye to standing there. He looked a little rattled, and asked me if I'd come make a statement. Nasty Girl had attacked a cop with a knife. I told Julie I had to go, and I'd explain it all later. Sitting at airport police headquarters, I couldn't help but hear loud wails from a not-too-distant holding cell, followed by the thuds of Nasty Girl's powerful kicks. The officers around me kept shaking their heads in amazement at the sheer power and volume of her rage. An exasperated cop finally came out of the holding cell, slamming the door behind her. She told her fellow officers, "If you want her wig off, you'll have to do it yourselves." Apparently they'd needed to remove her wig to check whether she was carrying a concealed weapon in it. The cops then gathered in a circle and drew matchsticks to see who'd be the lucky one to take the wig off. Finally the cop who'd lost burst out of Nasty Girl's cell, letting out his best war cry while shaking a long black mane above his head. "I got it. I got it." I signed my statement. The policeman whom she'd attacked would ensure that she didn't bother me for a while. When I arrived at the arena for Nitro, I found that Russo had concocted a storyline around me being forced by Terry Funk to wrestle a title match against my own NWO team member Kevin Nash. I'd hoped to be off that night, but instead I had to hurry away to buy black skater shorts, new running shoes and knee pads, and change in time to air live clips of me and Kevin getting worked up and dressing for the match. With my head thick and thumping and that stabbing pain in my neck, I taped my ankles, wrapped my broken down knees, and smeared my lower back with gobs of icy hot. Just another day in my pain-filled life. Kevin had read my last Calgary Sun column and told me, "You shouldn't be too hard on yourself, it's not your fault the business is so fucked up." He promised me we'd take it real easy, and then he surprised me when he said, "The match I had with you back at Survivor in 1995 was the best damn match I ever had. You're the best worker this business ever knew. And that's the God's honest truth." I smiled and thanked him, wondering all the while why Kevin had put so many rocks in my path at WCW if that was the way he truly felt. I made my way out to the ring, WCW champion of the world, with a big gold belt hung on my shoulder. I felt less than myself in a sleeveless NWO shirt and runners. If I'd been able to foresee the future, I would have strutted out there in my pink and black tights and my shades, and I'd have climbed all 4 turnbuckles, taking in the faces of the fans who loved me in those final moments. I was Humpty Dumpty, about to fall and never be put back together again. I'll forever imagine how it could have been, with fans, young and old, slowly rising, proudly standing and clapping and waving signs. In my mind's eye I read them, "Hitman, you were the best, we'll miss you." But I was the last one to know that this would be my last dance. The bell rang, and Kevin and I worked hard and well together. He protected me as best he could. I chopped him down at the knees, and we let Russo's silly storyline unfold. It wasn't long before Kevin dropped me hard with a punishing sidewalk slam. I was rocked, and the next thing I saw was Arnold Anderson on the floor cracking Kevin across the back with a rubber lead pipe, which was my cue. I forced myself up to fend Arn off with a steel chair, when suddenly Psycho Sid was behind me. As I turned, he mistimed his frontal kick, but somehow I still managed to clunk myself on the head with the chair anyway. Sid snatched me by the throat, hoisted me up over his head with one hand and held me, then drove me down into the mat with a choke slam. He pulled me right back up and proceeded to give me his powerbomb. I tucked my chin to protect myself as I floated to the mat in slow motion, but I landed flat and hard. Lying on my back staring up at the lights, I saw millions of tiny silver dots everywhere. A galaxy of stars. Like a TV falling from a high shelf, my tube smashed and I lay there not moving. I couldn't help but think this must be what you see in the seconds before you die. I thought of Owen and tears filled my eyes. Then I managed to roll out of the ring to see Terry Funk racing out, brandishing a flaming branding iron and pretending to burn Kevin with it. By the time I sat down to unlace my boots, I'd already forgotten enough of what had just happened that I complained only about the pain in my neck. The next day, in Erie, Pennsylvania, for Thunder, I told Russo again that I was hurt. He replied with a confident grin that I wasn't to worry, I didn't have to wrestle. Instead, he had a storyline built around me turning babyface, appearing to be taken hostage by a hostile NWO, only to swerve everyone by the end of the show when I'd double-cross Funk and turn heel again. I hated it, but at that point I'd have done anything not to actually have to wrestle. I was so foggy it didn't occur to me that I could have just told them I was hurt and gone home, but maybe I stayed because it had always been so ingrained in me to keep going no matter what. Besides, Russo was on such thin ice I wanted to do whatever I could for him. I don't know why. It was just my nature, I guess. With hindsight, as soon as I told my WCW bosses I thought I had a concussion, they should have sent me home. I opened the show coming out in a t-shirt and jeans for a heartfelt in-ring interview. I apologized to the fans for taking the wrong road and told them I was so disgusted with myself that I didn't deserve their respect. The camera cut to a fan holding a sign that read, "Respect Bret Hart." I saw one older woman in the bleachers cheering and jumping for joy, and I hated the thought of seeing their faces. When I turned heel again at the end of the night, then I challenged the NWO, and when they came out, Kevin declared, "Tonight, Hitman, your career will be finished, maybe even your life." All through the show there were clips of me being held hostage, choked and bullied with baseball bats by Nash, Shiner and Jarrett for my disloyalty to the NWO. They even burned some pink tights, not mine but they said they were, in effigy, setting them alight in a trash can. At the end, I made my escape, limping out into the ring holding a bat, and I again challenged the NWO to fight me. Seconds later, we were all taunting one another with bats and chairs. The 3-to-1 odds were too much for Terry Funk and a cavalry of WCW babyfaces to take, and they charged the ring to rescue me. I saw the old lady in the bleachers clapping and cheering like a schoolgirl. Then Arn tossed a pail of water in my face so everyone could see that my blackened eyes were only makeup. Unfortunately for Russo, nobody understood it. So I smashed Funk with a rubber bat to reveal the double cross. I felt like a total piece of shit as the NWO beat all the baby faces down with bats. And my heart filled with shame at the sight of the old woman in the stands now sobbing like a baby. On Thursday, January 13th, I sat in Dr. Mawissi's office in Calgary, telling him about Goldberg's ferocious kick to my neck while he felt around with his fingers. I told him about taking the choke slam and seeing silver dots. He noticed that I was slurring my words and asked me if I thought I had a concussion. I told him maybe a slight one. He probed me with questions and then recited some numbers and asked me to repeat them back to him backwards. I couldn't. Then he gave me 5 random words that he'd ask me to remember in a few minutes. I couldn't. He studied me, then asked me again if I thought I had a concussion. I told him again, a slight one. He asked me what I was taking for my headaches, and when I told him 4 Advils every 3 hours, he shook his head and told me they'd eat a hole in my stomach as he wrote me a proper prescription. I can feel a hole in the back of your neck the size of a quarter. He felt around the back of my skull. This part here feels like hamburger. I have a pay-per-view on Sunday. I'm the main event. With a dry smile he said, "You're not going anywhere. The problem with people that have concussions is that you think you're okay, but you're not." He paused and crossed his arms, looking me in the eye. "I hate to be the one to have to tell you this, but your career is probably over. What happens if I don't stop? The boxing world likes to pretend that Muhammad Ali's problems today are all related to Parkinson's disease. But the simple truth is Ali kept on boxing after being concussed. All those blows to the head cost him. You're no different than him, and I'm sure you don't want to end up like him. I don't want you doing anything. It could take up to a year before we can even determine how bad this is. No working out, no flying, no watching TV, no listening to loud music. When I call WCW, what should I tell them? You tell them your doctor has diagnosed you with a severe concussion. Yeah, but who are you? I meant, why would WCW believe him? I'm the chairman of the NHL Injury Committee. Tell them to call me. Driving home, tears came to my eyes as I thought about calling J.J. Dillon with the news. After 23 years, I didn't want to go out like this. What'd I do now? By that weekend, Vince Russo had been sacked and WCW rewrote their storylines without me. It was like I had never been there. I had been erased. I sat home staring blankly at the walls with the TV off and lights dimmed. I couldn't even read. My head hurt so much. Julie was pissed off and wasn't talking to me again. For comfort, I relied on the steadfast loyalty of a pug dog named Coombs, which Dallas had given me. He rested his head on my lap doing his best Jim Neidhart impression with a face that looked even sadder than mine. I didn't want to lose myself to brooding, and Dr. Mewisi told me to find a hobby. When I was chosen by Calgary's Glenbow Museum as one of 6 guest curators to help design an exhibit paying tribute to Canadian heroes, I really put my heart into it. One of my choices was Tom Longboat, one of Canada's most famous long-distance marathon runners in the early 1900s. My mom surprised me with a story about how Longboat had run against her father, Harry. My father impressed upon me that a marathon runner never, ever turns his head to look back, Helen said. It's just not done. It throws off the timing. But in a big race one day, my father could hear footsteps behind him, always there, and so, for just a moment, he turned and his gaze was caught by the brown eyes of Tom Longboat, only a step behind him. Then Longboat edged past him. I don't know who won the race, but my father never forgot the speed and grace of that kid or the look in his eye. WCW desperately needed me to make a tour of Germany in February. I was the headliner and it was sold out. I'd only step into the ring to say a few words to the fans. Reluctantly, Dr. M cleared me to fly, mostly because I was afraid I'd be fired if I didn't. Duggan, Sting, Knobs and Liz all reached out to me with supportive arms. A big, young, white-haired kid from Philadelphia named Jerry Toot, who worked as the wall, insisted on carrying my bags for me. Still, I couldn't help but see that most of the other wrestlers didn't believe I was hurt. When I slurred my words, they grinned at me like I was putting them on, which hurt because I had never faked an injury in my real life or missed a match on purpose. But there were so many worked injuries in WCW that when somebody got hurt for real, hardly anybody believed it. On the bus in Hamburg, I had a talk with Jeff Jarrett, who had been one of Owen's closest friends. He told me he was offended when Martha's lawyers pressed him about any possible philandering Owen might have been doing, and had refused to even call them back. I told him that they were just doing their job, checking out every aspect of Owen's life, and for the sake of Owen's kids, he needed to talk to them. He told me how he and Deborah McMichael, his valet, had been up next after Owen's match in Kansas City, and backstage everyone was running around in a panic, as Jeff stood at the gorilla position. Owen's dead body was wheeled past him at the same time as 2 firm hands shoved him hard through the curtain. Go. 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 He told me he was sorry he went out to the ring that night and that he bawled his eyes out the whole time, as he did again just telling me about it. Terry Funk had been listening to us, and now he asked me how my family was doing. I told him how crazy things had got up at Hart House. Terry knew the Harts pretty well, and he gave it some deep thought before telling me everybody's crazy. The whole world's crazy. You're crazy. I'm crazy. It's all about to what degree you're crazy. In my concussed state, Terry made a lot of sense. Poor Davey was a case in point. He was a shell of his former self and still hooked on morphine. Being in no shape to wrestle, he hadn't lasted long in the WWF, but Vince still said he needed him, so he headed off to a rehab program in Georgia. In answer to my criticisms of the year-end show on Stampede Wrestling, that involved various non-wrestling members of the Hart family, Bruce ripped into me on the Stampede Wrestling website for taking shots at Davey in my column. He defended Davey, saying he was a damn loyal and trusted trooper of the clan who'd been unjustly maligned and made to look bad. Bruce had as much right to express his opinion as I did, but he didn't know the truth. I felt more and more estranged from so many people in my family because nobody stood shoulder to shoulder with me in defending Martha, except my mom. Keith, Wayne, Allison and Ross all steered clear of Ellie and Diana, supporting me only from behind the scenes. I understood why Georgia was on Ellie's side. She had spent her whole life defending Ellie and turning a blind eye to Ellie's actions, and she would never forget Ellie's support when she went through the loss of her son, Matt. Struggling with my concussion, I'd begun ducking Martha's calls. It was too hard to listen to her rant about how Ellie and Diana were bullying my parents into settling with Vince like a heel tag team. Martha said, and I agreed, that Diana, Ellie and even Bruce thought that life is like wrestling and that they can just turn themselves heel and then turn back babyface over Christmas, expecting to be forgiven. At the building in Hamburg, Terry Taylor handed me a 5-page script and told me I had to cut a heel promo on my German fans. I won't do it, I said. Just let me go out and say a few words. I walked out to chants of Owen, and explained that I'd suffered a concussion that might end my career, and if I didn't get another chance I wanted to tell my German fans I'd never forget them. I talked about how much I loved Owen, and how the last match we ever had was right here in Hamburg. The emotional outpouring from the crowd was powerful enough that it took me a long time to do my walk around. When I finally came back through the curtain, Terry Taylor hung his head, ashamed that he had asked me to rip into fans who loved me so much. Each night after his hardcore matches, Brian Knobbs came back to the dressing room with a new ugly gash in his head. I couldn't help but draw him on the blackboard, showing the progression from day 1 of the tour, when he was smiling and happy, to days 3 and 4, looking more bloodied and battered. In the last drawing, he was in a wheelchair with lumps on his head, and the caption was startling new evidence. Pro wrestling is real. Brian laughed and hugged me when he saw it. On the last night of the tour, in Leipzig, a 4-year-old girl in a white dress climbed into the ring with flowers, ran up to me and jumped into my arms. She held me tight like she was taking care of me now. Everybody was crying and chanting for Owen. Every outstretched hand I touched around the ring empowered me like God's angels, boosting my batteries. I had one last bus ride with the boys. I have a vague memory of the wall taking a handful of pills and of someone shaving his eyebrows. Ric Flair made the mistake of standing in the aisle, and when the driver hit the brakes, he took an ugly fall into the stairwell. When he got up very slowly, I wondered how much longer he could keep going. I didn't tempt fate anymore and was happy to have my seatbelt on. WCW spared no expense, putting me on the Concorde to rocket to New York City for a toy fair. I was happy to have the chance to experience such sophisticated speed before they retired it. At the toy fair I met fellow Calgarian Todd McFarlane, creator of Spawn. I was a big fan of his comics, and we joked about his old Aberhart High School beating Manning in basketball but never in wrestling. At that convention I saw the coolest Hitman action figures ever created, but nobody would ever see them. Unbeknownst to anyone, and like the Concorde, WCW was almost out of business. From the toy fair, I was beamed across America to Las Vegas for a signing at the Nitro Grill. I had some Hitman dolls in my overhead bag, and every few minutes one of them would call out, "Ouch," which got me a lot of strange looks for the whole flight. After the signing, I dashed off to make a flight home, but once we were in the air they announced that all flights were backed up and it didn't look like we'd land in Salt Lake City on time to make my connection. My head pounded, and every time I looked out the window at the clouds below the mountain peaks I thought of heaven and Owen. Soon my mind wandered to the thought of him lying on the mat like a dying bird after hitting a car windshield. I thought, I need to get home, Owen. Just then a woman passenger collapsed in the aisle right beside me, and the flight attendant feverishly worked on her. "We're losing her," she called out to another attendant. A run.w.a.y was cleared at the Salt Lake City airport so we could land. The woman was met by paramedics, and I raced across the terminal and squeezed through the doors of my plane home just as they were closing. That night was a combination of heartbreak and wonder. That's when I had a most powerful dream about Owen, who woke me from a deep sleep. He had tears in his eyes and was angry. "What is a life worth?" he said. "So is that all I'm worth? Fucking kill me and I'm worth $36 million? Is that it?" I told him, "Owen, it's not about the money. You know that." He was also seething about Ellie and Diana, and I didn't know how to comfort him as big tears slowly dripped down his cheeks. This dream haunted me enough that at the time I kept it to myself. But it didn't surprise me afterwards, when the next day Martha told me she had come up with a settlement number for Vince's lawyers, $32 million, close enough to my dream to spook me. I haven't dreamed of Owen since then. I kept waiting for the headaches to fade and my life to return to normal, but every time I saw Dr. M, he told me it was going to take time. When I told him I couldn't feel the hole in my neck, he asked me to lie on a padded table in his office and told me to relax my head in his hands. As he poked around, he slipped his finger an inch deep into my neck. I told him I cried all the time, and asked whether it was normal when even a shaving commercial could bring me to tears. He looked me in the eyes and said, You're gonna start crying right now, aren't you? I instantly blinked back tears, thinking, what the fuck is wrong with me? Again, he told me it was all part of the concussion. My brain was like the squares on a soccer ball, and the square that triggers pleasure had been bruised. He arranged for all kinds of brain tests with world-renowned specialists in Toronto and Montreal, and he even sent me to a psychologist. I was trying to take it easy, but simple things like carrying my groceries, tying my shoes, or doing shoulder checks while I drove only aggravated the never-ending headache from hell. Steak tasted like liver and my libido disappeared. I was afraid I'd never get better. I showed up to see my parents every other day, only to get into it with Ellie about Survivor Series yet again. Diana would join in, screaming at me that everything was my fault because I wouldn't drop the belt to Shawn Michaels. Diana, Ellie, and even Bruce hated that Paul J's documentary, which had now been seen all over the world, portrayed me as some kind of Canadian hero. A whole new audience beyond the wrestling world now respected me for standing up for what was right. Ellie left me a phone message demanding to know what options my parents had and that someone needed to enlighten her as to why this was the way things had to go. I wasn't even sure what she meant, and it was beyond me to understand why she kept calling me about the lawsuit when our parents and Martha made all the decisions having to do with it. In her message, Ellie said that she had no hard feelings and that she and Diana hadn't done anything wrong. But the truth was, unbeknownst to anyone at the time, they'd long since faxed Jerry McDivitt at the WWF a copy of Gary Robb's entire case file, which my mom had left on her desk. All I ever truly asked of Ellie and Diana was for them to stop making comments about Owen's case until we knew what happened. I kept saying, just do what Owen would want you to do, but they wouldn't listen. I knew that our confrontations would ultimately lead to the destruction of the Hart family and thought Vince must be laughing at how easy it was to play the Harts against one another. Over the next few months, the only joy I got was when I took my parents to watch the real Hitmen, who were first in the Western Hockey League, WHL, and making another run for the Memorial Cup. The only time I ever saw my dad forget his broken heart after Owen died was one night when the Hitmen won a game in overtime, and he rose up to his feet jubilantly clapping as hard as he could. One time Stu asked me what it would take to make peace with Ellie and Diana. Maybe it was selfish of me, but I could only shake my head and tell him sadly, out of respect for Owen, I can't. I kept myself busy doing promotional work for WCW in order to receive half, and then a quarter, of my salary. According to my contract, they could fire me any time after 6 weeks if I couldn't wrestle. If I did appearances, they kept paying me, but the longer I was out of the ring the less they paid. Dr. M told me that it'd be at least 9 more months before we'd know anything. Despite my best efforts, it became more clear to me every day that I'd evolved into a wrestling tragedy just as I'd feared. Thank God I had thought to take out an insurance policy from Lloyd's of London to cover me. It made little sense to me, or anyone else, when I was flown to Nitro in Denver on April 10th that year. But as I was asked, I charged into the ring, bashed Hogan with a chair, and in an act of pathetic desperation, Hogan juiced big time. Good guys don't last long in a wrestling office, especially when times are bad. Soon after that Nitro, Bill Bush was fired and replaced by Brad Siegel, a TV exec who knew even less about the wrestling business than his predecessors. Bischoff and Russo were back and, ironically, the new storyline centered around 2 failed experts joining together to save WCW. By the time I did Thunder in Memphis on May 2nd, every wrestler knew the WCW ship was sinking. It didn't surprise me to spot Lex and Liz openly sipping long neck beers on the hood of their car at the back of the building. For some reason, Jarrett was called upon to smash a gimmicked guitar over my back. Things had gotten so bad that on May 7th, Owen's birthday, a 150-pound actor named David Arquette won the WCW World title from Jarrett at the Kemper Arena. That same day I was home in Calgary. I'd been scheduled to be in Kansas City to be deposed by Jerry McDivitt, but it was canceled at the last minute, so I drove to Owen's grave for the first time in a while. I found myself telling the black marble monument, adorned with flowers and weathered cards and letters, that it was time for me to pick up the pieces. Just then 2 jackrabbits hopped right past me. I wondered if they were brothers. I wondered if Owen's death was some kind of colossal super rib that he was subjecting the whole family to in order to expose our shortcomings. It had ruined us and it would never, ever get better. I told Owen I loved him, that I'd fight to the end for him, and then broke down hard. Diana had begun a serious romance with one of Bruce's novice wrestlers, a young kid named James. No one could blame her, but it didn't help things when she phoned Davey to tell him about it while he was dealing with the worst phase of rehab. He immediately checked himself out and flew home. There were several explosive clashes between Diana, Davey and Stu at Hart House, including one where Davey inadvertently knocked Stu down and hurt Stu's shoulder. The police were called and Davey made the front page of the Calgary Sun, being led away in handcuffs. Bruce kindly offered Davey a place to stay. Before I got hurt, I'd promised to do some appearances to promote a Hitman photo book. Concussed or not, I did major talk shows where they'd invariably ask me about Owen. Inadvertently, I became the spokesperson for the rights of wrestlers and the wrongs of the business. I talked of the need for a wrestlers' union and wrestling schools, and I condemned the stupidity of backyard wrestling, a fad where young teens often put one another in the hospital because of real hardcore matches. I didn't feel comfortable being the voice of everything negative about the business because I still had a lot of friends making a living in it, but I still had a lot of passion for my art form. It was being killed off, and I felt the need to defend it. A while before I had taken on Bruce Allen as a manager. In June that year, he told me he'd always had his doubts that I was hurt. I was about to leave for Montreal to see Dr. Karen Johnston at McGill University to take comprehensive brain tests. Concussions are still largely misunderstood, and the medical world was only starting to see how broad-ranging their effects can be, from symptoms that last only a few minutes to those that change a person forever. I underwent various brain scans, x-rays, and a functional MRI, which all left my head pounding like a drum. Some of the tests were at Montreal General Hospital, where I met a young man of about 19 by the name of Antoine. His girlfriend spotted me coming through the front door, and then she and his brother loaded Antoine up in his wheelchair and found me in the radiology department. I felt kind of silly talking to them wearing only a little blue hospital gown and slippers, but Antoine was a huge fan of mine and was dying of cancer. His girlfriend told me that with 3 tumors in his brain he was in a lot of pain. He told me that I was his hero, how he cried after Survivor Series, and that wrestling wasn't the same after that. I said, yes, that was the day that wrestling died. Then he spoke about Owen and broke down crying in his wheelchair, and I changed my mind and thought, no, that was the day wrestling died. But all of it seemed irrelevant in the face of the fact that Antoine only had a few days left to live. He bravely accepted it and smiled when he told me the first person he'd look for in heaven would be Owen. He joked about delivering any messages I might have, and I told him, just tell Owen I miss him. Oh, and tell him I know it's him ribbing us all. For 3 nights in a row I visited Antoine in his hospital room until late in the evenings, talking about his girlfriend, the world, and wrestling. When I told him stories about Owen's pranks, he laughed until he cried, and it really filled my heart. Everywhere I went, the people of Montreal apologized for what happened to me with Vince in their city, but they had nothing to apologize for. Montreal had always been very good to me. Death and sadness weighed me down, and for no damn reason at all I ended up at a strip bar. Montreal's beautiful and skillful nude dancers were without a doubt the best in the world, and I lost myself in their moves. The boss welcomed me and played Tina Turner's Simply the Best as a compliment. I smiled at the memory of how Jim and I had hung our tag belts over the perfect breasts of 2 French beauties back in our old Heart Foundation days. A few days later, back in Calgary, I got the call that Antoine had died. I was only privileged to know him for a short time, but I'll never forget him. Ellie and Jim were making headlines of their own, with the police now breaking up their shouting matches. She had served him with a restraining order. Jim had been hired on by Vince as a talent scout, and sometimes we'd meet up to drink a few beers and I'd help him fabricate names for the scouting report he'd send on to Jim Ross. There were many who wondered why I never had any problems with Jim after Owen's death. Why would I have had problems? Jim never once made any comment about Owen's case, which is all that Martha ever asked of the family. My mom, who'd only just recovered from a blood clot and an irregular heartbeat, told me that tragedy and greed were what made some of my siblings react irrationally. To my mind, the Hart family had turned into the Jerry Springer Show. Davey, whom Bruce had taken in, had just become involved with Bruce's wife, Andrea, who'd feuded with Diana for years. Poor Bruce was now having loud shouting matches with Davey, with the police never far behind. The stress of it all took its toll on Stu. He was soon hospitalized with pneumonia. Then Davey overdosed on morphine. Then one of the grandkids accidentally burned Katie's place behind Hart House down. Even Lana, the old, crippled pit bull, keeled over dead. The Harts were simply drowning under waves of grief. Martha was anxious to put all the heartache behind her and start a charitable foundation in Owen's name. Then Ellie admitted in her deposition in the lawsuit that she did, in fact, take legal documents from my mom and dad and fax them right to Vince's lawyers, including the allocation agreement. No one knew what the ramifications of this would be, and there was concern that the trial could be delayed because of it. Of course, this led to another furious meltdown between me and Ellie, especially when my mom tearfully told me that my dad had given $6,000 of the money I'd given to help them out to Ellie. My temper got the best of me and I hurled one of Stu's antique chairs into a wall, shattering it to pieces. After that blow-up, Ellie left me a phone message. I haven't done anything, Brett. You won't get the satisfaction that you ultimately wanted from Vince over Montreal, and a bunch of lawyers are getting the money. Mom and Dad should be able to get on with their lives. I don't know what makes you think that you're such a genius. Maybe you need to rethink things, Brett. I know it will never be right between me and you, and I don't really care, but the one I do feel bad about is Martha, but I'm sure all of this will work out for Martha, and I pray to God that it does. I haven't done anything except stand my ground and what I said right from the very start. That we should try and work this out, because the only ones that are going to win are a bunch of lawyers, and it's going to rip the family apart, and it has. At least you know my point of view and respect it. I was asked to show up at Nitro in Las Cruces on August 28th, where I saw Bill Goldberg for the first time since he nearly cut his own arm off breaking that car window. He hugged me and told me how sorry he was about my concussion. I had no doubt about that. Bill was a good man. Unfortunately, he'd been pushed too fast and didn't understand his brute strength. That night we both followed the insane booking angles. I hit Goldberg with a rubber shovel and pretended to bury him alive in the New Mexico desert. Maybe he should have been burying me for real. Dr. M called to tell me the verdict was in. It was official, I'd never wrestle again. I went home and waited for Dr. Johnston to second Dr. M's opinion before I said anything to WCW. As Bob Dylan wrote, it's when you think you've lost everything that you find out you can always lose a little more. He was so right. WCW had me show up on September 4th for Dallas Nitro just to slam Goldberg's head with a cage door. The following night at Thunder, a WCW angle reduced my very real concussion into a silly storyline when they had me go face-to-face with Goldberg in the middle of the ring. I was slurring my words for real, following the script to whine about how he hurt me, when a wave of emotion came over me as I realized that nobody was getting it. Everyone, including all the fans, thought I was just acting like I was concussed. Then the big screen played the definitive camera angle of Goldberg's foot plowing into my head, one that I'd never seen before. The crowd laughed and jeered me as Goldberg dressed me down verbally. Afterwards, I felt like a whore as I remembered the devastating impact of Goldberg's foot connecting with my head, reinforced by what I'd seen up on the big screen. And I'd let them exploit it for ratings. At the end of the month, I returned to Montreal for more brain injury tests. When I was done, Antoine's bereaved parents picked me up and had me over for a home-cooked meal.